So the big question is this. We know spontaneous remissions and so-called miracle cures exist. We also know they aren't so spontaneous after all. I'm living proof of this, having cured my quote-unquote incurable illness. There's something to how this happens. So how do we, as humans with chronic symptoms, tap into this so-called miraculous healing capacity? That is the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Dr. Erin Hayford, and welcome to the Sacred Illness Podcast. Before we begin today's episode, just my standard medical disclaimer. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The content should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional regarding any medical concerns. And welcome to this episode of the Sacred Illness Podcast. I'm Dr. Erin, and joining me today is Oriana, who is a coach and kind of co-facilitator of this work that we do together. So she's going to be co-hosting with me for the foreseeable future, and I'm really excited to have her on board. I think it's going to bring some layers of richness and just more interaction and energy to these podcasts and this work that we're doing. So welcome, Oriana. I'm glad to have you here today.
So happy to be here.
So today's topic is this idea of intellectualizing the work that we do. So this work is all about mind-body medicine, connecting the mind with the body. And, there's a body component to this. And so while the mind is obviously important because we need our mind to learn and to take in new information and to understand things, there's a sort of a thing that I have seen in the people that I have worked with, and it's been coming up in conversation lately between Oriana and myself, just about this idea of like how if we stop there, like we can just learn things like ad nauseum, like keep going, like there's always more to learn, especially when you're getting into a new modality or, when you discover mind-body medicine for the first time or just whatever it is you're doing, there's this potential for us to get stuck maybe in that mode of like acquiring information. And I know I'm certainly guilty of that. Like I kept going to school. Like I just kept taking classes and getting more degrees because I just wanted to keep learning. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to learn. There's nothing wrong with kind of like philosophizing or like trying to understand things on this intellectual level. But it's ignoring the body component of the mind-body connection. And I think of it as like walking the talk, right? It's one thing to really understand these concepts and to understand them, like what it means and what it, why it's important and how to incorporate it into your life. But if there's that lack of a bridge between the mind and the body where you are actually doing it, like doing the work, then, or not necessarily doing the work, but like embodying the knowledge, then that's a kind of a place people can get hung up. And so what's been coming up in conversation is how this constant intellectualizing, this constant like thinking about it and, feeling never really complete, like feeling like, well, I don't quite know enough yet, is actually more so of a coping mechanism than it is than anything else at some point. Like, I think there's like this threshold you cross where you're learning new things. You're quite, we have to learn something sort of initially before we can start to apply it. But then there's this line we can cross where we just keep learning, right? We just keep like reading more books or going to more therapists or doing more stuff. And then that's where we're kind of in this like purgatory, for lack of a better word, of like, being all in the mind and not ever really applying it to your life. And then that's where you can start to get frustrated of like, well, this isn't working, right? Like nothing's changing. I know all this stuff. Why is nothing working? And this came up for me this past week, actually working with someone one-on-one. He is doing so much. He's working so hard on his own healing journey, working with PTSD and a lot of chronic illnesses that have sprung up kind of like in his trauma journey, right? And so in my world, again, chronic illness is part of sort of a result of the things we're holding in our bodies as a result of trauma and chronic stress. So we're seeing his illnesses as a manifestation of his traumatic past. He is like a trauma expert at this point in his life. He has learned so much. He could teach classes, right? Like he basically has a PhD in trauma. Like he knows so much about trauma and the nervous system and the body and all of the responses. And he was sharing with me how he spends his whole day like scheduling his stuff, like his therapies that he does, these exercises he does, the supplements he's taking, the medications he's like, his whole world is built around doing these things, like checking these boxes. And when I asked him, like, okay, are you taking this in? Are you like absorbing this love and self-care and these rituals you're doing around your healing process? He was like, well, no, I guess not, because I don't actually love myself. I don't actually care about myself, right? He's got a lot of wounds around early childhood with mom and dad, not receiving love, not receiving care. So for him, it's this very intellectual, like it all makes sense what he's doing. Although I would argue it's a bit much in terms of like it's stressing him out. Like it's so much stuff, it stresses him out. But in his mind, there's this like very intellectual reason for doing all the things. And so we started to turn this corner together of like, how do we start to take what you're doing and like actually let it absorb into your body, actually let you take it in? Because otherwise it's sort of this coping mechanism of constantly engaging in something and learning about it and doing something. It's like you're still kind of like moving away from the body. You're detaching from the body in some way. The body in some way is not a safe place for you to go. So you're staying up in your mind. And that is certainly true for his body. And like there's things down there he doesn't want to feel or see. So that's kind of the introduction, I guess, to this idea of intellectualizing. And Oriana, I'm just curious because you said yourself you've been kind of seeing this in your own life and like your own healing journey. And also, obviously, like we said, we've been talking about it and seeing in folks we work with. What's your relationship with intellectualizing, or like how does this show up in your own life?
So, I mean, I can relate to your patient, of course, because that's how I started my healing journey, is doing, how many things can I do? What, planning out my meals, exactly what to eat and what, and being very stringent and strict about it. And actually started to make things worse because I was more stressed about what I couldn't eat and where I could go, and all of the things that happen when we've had trauma. And I think as I started to move through the work, I started to realize how impacted I was as a child from not having support and not understanding my environment. And that was just like a top layer of trauma, right? Like not getting into the nitty-gritty of all of the things that had actually happened to me as a child and throughout my life, but just that like top layer of the reason I went to school for psychology, the reason I went to wellness school, all the things that I did was trying to understand people in my environment. And I didn't realize until even recently that part of understanding that is not only feeling safe in your body, therefore feeling safe in your environment, but a big part of understanding your environment is understanding yourself. And to understand yourself, you have to come out of your mind and into your body. I had been reading that book Cured that we had talked about. And so there's like a lot of this coming up for me in different aspects of this terrain theory of the soil that we create within us. I think intellectualizing is about thinking about what plants we're going to put there and, what seeds are, we're thinking about all these things, but we never do anything with the soil to actually start planting, to actually start growing.
Yeah.
And so that's how I feel this intellectual piece of this healing journey, because I think it is part of the healing. I think everybody goes through it, and it's the amount of time that we spend in it that creates the space of, like that linear time space that we live in of how long it's going to take us to heal, basically, is being able to go beyond that, being able to come down into our bodies, come down into that soil of who we are, into our inner terrain, and start to actually change it versus constantly grasping at information. But I think that is also part of our culture too, is we're constantly inundated with information no matter where you are. And so I think it's like almost a purging that has to be created within yourself to come to drop down out of that logic, to drop down out of your mind and into a space of, okay, I am going to maybe take one thing, like our work, mind body work. I'm going to take this one thing and I'm going to exhaust it all the way to the end.
Yeah.
I'm not going to add anything else. I'm not going to, do anything. I'm going to totally like ground myself into this work and take it to the very, very nth degree, like as we say in some of your journaling prompts and what we do, of whatever it is that your fear is, take your fear and take it all the way to the end.
Yeah.
And what's the worst possible case scenario? It's like doing that, but in reverse. You're not taking it to the worst case scenario. You're taking it all the way to the end of, okay, I know that I've done everything that I can, and this particular thing didn't work, so I can move on to the next, which I would even beg to argue that once you take it all the way to the nth degree, you're not going to need the next thing, because you're going to have dropped down out of that logic point and be like, okay, now I'm understanding. And then you can start living those changes and living your life differently.
100%. Yeah, I love the relationship that you're drawing between like this, excuse me, this idea of intellectualizing and that soil theory. And so I'll link the book you mentioned in the notes below. It's Cured by Jeffrey Ridiger. I don't know how to say his name, but it's a really brilliant book about so-called spontaneous healing and remission. But it kind of debunks that as like it's not really like spontaneous or like a miracle. It's a capacity we all have, but you have to like do it, right? Like you have to engage in this work and be willing to look at the soil, be willing to actually put the plants in and see how they grow. Like you have to try it in order to see what actually happens. And I think, yeah, that image of like, when you were saying that, I was imagining like, an empty garden bed with like all the plants lined up and all the tools lined up with like a stack of gardening books and just like, okay, what could I put here? Well, no, maybe that should go there. Well, maybe, like you can plan for forever, there's always more to learn. And so I think of this, like, I like, in terms of when we think about this as a coping response, to me, it feels sort of like flight, so if you think about fight or flight, or maybe even a little bit of freeze, right? So when we get stressed out, when we get activated, when we get triggered, we move into a state of activation that's trying to get us away from the threat. And so I think there's this challenging threshold we stand on when we are starting to understand like the body keeps the score, right? To use that kind of phrase that we know now from that book. The body is what holds on to stuff until we're ready to see it and work with it and like release it or integrate it or whatever needs to happen. So if the body's kind of holding on to things and we're starting to understand that, like, that can be a really scary, it can be scary. It is scary, right? Like that we can start to understand like, oh yeah, I definitely faced a lot of adversity in my childhood, or, I'm afraid to like really understand the full depth of like, these experiences that I went through. Like we can get a sense that like our body is containing some very uncomfortable things. And because of that, we want to move away from it, right? Like if we're not accustomed to, if we don't know how to feel safe with that, if we don't know how to feel safe in our bodies, if we don't have, someone supporting us or guiding us, or if we just, whatever it is, I don't know, like there's so many variables that can keep someone from crossing that threshold and like going into the body and actually being with what's there. Mm-hmm. But whatever that thing is that's preventing it, our nervous system is going to detect like whatever is inside your body, like we're keeping you unaware of it. Like we're keeping it in your subconscious for a reason, because it is unpleasant and it is not good. And we don't want you to see it. And so we have a fight or flight response in response to it, right? Like it feels like a threat. Whatever's being contained in our body feels like a threat. And so we either fight it, which I think in that case, it can come in the form of like taking things to suppress it, like just kind of trying to like, basically you become like an enemy of your body, or your body becomes an enemy of you. And you're like, I hate my body. I want to shut off from it. I'm going to ignore it. Whatever that looks like, that could be more of a fight response. To me, this intellectualizing is kind of a flight freeze response, because you're technically like, you're kind of engaging with it in a way that you're still moving away from it. Like you're reading books, but it's kind of still taking you out of your body. You're moving away from it. Fight is more direct, like you're more directly like attacking it, so to speak. So I don't know if this analogy lands, but this is kind of how I'm thinking of it. Like you're intellectualizing it, you understand sort of what's happening, but you're still disconnecting. And freeze is like, you're not taking action, essentially. Like, and I think that's where we can get maybe caught up, is like, it feels like we're taking action. Like it feels like we're really doing something to heal, to move the needle, when we are reading books and we're seeing the therapist and we're doing all the things. And I keep talking about therapists just to put this little caveat in there, because I'm talking about like talk therapy, right? Like we can talk till we're blue in the face about our history, our trauma. But if we're not getting in the body, if we're not doing some sort of somatic, integration with, again, talking is intellectual, right? But if we're not somehow taking that and putting it in the body, we can do therapy, we can do talk therapy for 20 years and still feel like, but why am I not feeling better? Why is this not budging? And there's a time and a place for talk therapy. I'm not throwing it under the bus, but I think there's a threshold where we need to learn how to take it deeper. So again, we can feel like we're really doing something, like we're really engaging in healing work. And that's where it can start to feel frustrating of like, but then nothing is shifting. So how does that resonate with you, or does that like make sense to you too?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me. I think that bridge between being able to feel that I have this information, and then what? I think, and then what is that space where
Yeah.
we have to start speaking the truth to ourselves and feeling into that truth of, the things that keep us from moving out of fight or flight, whatever those layers are only found through truth. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
have to be honest with ourselves. If you started off with talk therapy, that's great, because that's a good place to start for pretty much all of us. And then there's a place where we have to be truthful with ourselves. Is this continuing to help me move forward in my journey versus just keeping me in this one place, like
Right.
freeze, or, keeping me, even being dishonest with ourselves about our own healing, right? Like, talk therapy or any therapies, really, if you're not dropping into it, can be, like you're saying, that flight response where we have the information, we're doing it, and that's what we're telling ourselves is,
Yeah.
I'm going to therapy, I'm eating this, I'm doing this supplement, I'm doing all of these things, and it's not working. But we stay stuck in that other place of, I'm doing all of this stuff, and we never get to the why of it not working. And so I think that bridge, that space, that movement to that next thing is the regulation. That's where we find that regulation, is we start to drop into that place. And that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're, happy and joyful and everything's wonderful and everything's gone away, because we've dropped into it. Now it's a different layer, right? And now we're working with something different, something deeper, and oftentimes harder. And I think then we can go back. Like, I think we
Mm-hmm.
talked about that too, where we get to this really deep place and things start to unfold and we're like, yikes, no way, I'm out of here. And then you
Yeah.
go back to the suppression, or you go back to whatever it was that wasn't working before, and just keep crossing your fingers and hoping that, maybe this one thing will work.
Totally. Yeah. And I have seen that in myself recently, that kind of like bouncing back thing. And, this, yeah, we talk about this a lot in terms of getting to, even when you start to embody it and you start to get into these deeper layers, like sometimes that it can bring up things, it often brings up things, I would say almost always brings up things you're not expecting, layers you aren't aware of until you start to dig in there. So there's many choice points in this work of turning back, right? So once you start to cross that intellectualizing threshold and do start to get into your body, yeah, there's many times where turning around feels safer, like going back to that familiar space, going back to that familiar way of being. And as I was saying, I've seen that in myself recently, as I have gotten into some deep layers of my own healing work and my own, my life journey, essentially, like layers continue to come up. Like, I don't think that ever stops. And I have found that, like, when I'm in a particularly challenging layer or facing a particularly like challenging core belief or wound or whatever you want to call it, I will kind of just stop doing the work for a while. Like, I might stop journaling. I will stop doing my subconscious meditations and somatic practices that I do. I'll just find reasons to not, or I'll like zone out on my phone. Like, normally what I will do is like go to bed, and when I get into bed, I'll do some journaling and do some meditations, and I'll just lay there and scroll on my phone and then be like, oh crap, it's too late, I guess I'll go to bed. Like, there's this like really strong avoidance like thing that comes up in my body. And so I think it's important to note that happens. It can happen at any stage, and awareness is really the key to all of this. And I think that's kind of what you and I had been texting about prior to recording this episode, is that awareness is really the first step, like becoming aware that intellectualizing is actually a thing, right? Like, it's actually a way in which you can stall your healing process. Like, that is the first step to seeing it for what it is and engaging in it differently. Because I think a lot of this work is like that. Like, we talk about often that this work is like a paradigm shift, right? Like, we're trying to change the way we think about our bodies, our health, our illnesses. And again, if we think of intellectualizing, or if we think of like learning and acquiring information and even going to therapy or talking about stuff as, we think of it as a good thing, because it is. I mean, really, it's not like a bad thing at all to like want to learn and want to understand these things. But when you start to understand, like, there's again, that threshold of like, are you going too far with that and not ever applying what you're learning into your life? Then you can start to really, again, like you were saying, have this more honest reflection and kind of be more truthful with what's going on in your world and like how you're moving through your illness or whatever. So it's all about perspective and understanding, like, where did I start to, where did the learning stop being helpful and where did it start being protective, I guess, is maybe that threshold that we're talking about. Like, what is that line? And there's no right answer, right? It's different for everyone. But I think it's like when you get to a certain point where you're like, this makes a ton of sense. I totally can see how this applies to me. Like, that's where it's like, okay, let's get started, right? Like, let's just start doing it, because you can keep learning. That's my balance. That's what I try to do, is I continue to try to learn more and more and more about this stuff, and I think some of us are drawn to just learn our whole lives. Like, I don't think, again, that's not like a bad thing, but I think it becomes detrimental if it's getting in the way of us actually doing the work at the same time. So I think of this work as like, there's many things that have to be in motion kind of at the same time, where you're doing the work, which I think we should talk about what that actually means, because I'm thinking that people might be wondering, like, okay, so how do I cross that threshold into like actually doing it? But yeah, they're like doing the work, maybe learning about the work if that feels pertinent to you. I think, honestly, we say this all the time, like, everything you need is already inside of you. Like, you don't need to technically learn any of this in order to do the work. It's all in there. A lot of this is actually like tuning into the body and trusting what you find there and following that intuition. And again, kind of changing paradigms around fear and symptoms and the kind of stuff that we talk about, so that you kind of know your path. But you don't have to know what fight or flight means in order to heal it. You don't need to know it's I think it's just like, what actually helps you, like, what do you need to take away from this to like give you enough information to move forward. But you don't need to like have a PhD in the nervous system if that's even a thing in order to do this work, right? Yeah, so that idea of like how to start embodying this work, like how to cross the threshold. I don't know if this is something you can think of, Oriana, in your own journey, but like, what did that look like for you? Like, when you started to cross that line between learning and doing, like, and I don't know if there was like a moment or like if it took time, or like, but what did that look like, if you can remember?
I think there were little moments, and I think that they even still come up as you move through this journey. I think they're less and less, and I think you have more of a flow in your life than previous. For me, it would like be a moment where I'd have to, like, we'll just go back to like fear and information. A lot of times when symptoms for me would flare up, or they would come back or get worse, or whatever the layer of that healing version was, I would drop into fear, and then fear would push me to look for more information. And so instead of turning and facing that fear, I would get on my phone or pick up a book that, or go searching for a book. Like, anxiety has been one that's kind of stuck around a little bit longer than my other symptoms. And so I'll go find a book of, how to heal anxiety naturally, because there's still that part of me that knows that if I suppress that, I know that I'm the type of person that will never go back. Like, if you're going to tell me that I can make it go away and then I can live my life, sweet, I'm going to go and do it. But then I also know, if I do that, what that looks like, because I watched it happen growing up. I watched it happen with the women in my family. Like, all of them were on anti-anxiety meds. And I can tell you every single moment of every day when they took that medicine, because I watched them change. I watched everything shut off. Like, it was like numb. Like, you could watch the switch, like a light switch. They went from whatever their episode was, whether it be manic or sad or whatever, to just flatline.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of fear with that for me. So when it comes to those symptoms, I'll turn to fear, and then I'll start searching for information. And to me, at one point, I had validated that it was okay to do that because I was looking for natural methods, where actually it doesn't matter. I mean, at that point, your system is dysregulated. You can go searching for natural methods, or you can go, to your doctor and get a medication. Either way, you're still keeping yourself dysregulated. So I started to realize that it didn't matter. Like, I had to find a way outside of that. I couldn't stay in the fear and keep doing that over and over again. And so even though I still struggle with that, I am now able to be like, okay, I see what I'm doing here. Let's, take a breath. What is it that my body is wanting? If I'm already in a dysregulated state and I've already turned the fear dial all the way up to high, then that means I'm in fight or flight or freeze. So which one of those am I in, and what does my body want from me in that moment? If I'm in freeze, a lot of times it just means just laying there, like a lump on a log, and just allowing myself to do that and not trying to think, I should be up doing this and going through my to-do list. If it's fight, go outside and exert some energy, whatever that is. Like, my little dog plays with his little soccer ball, and I'll kick that soccer ball, and that energy, I can feel it start to move through my body. So even fight doesn't have to come out in the traditional way that we think about it, where we're like upset and angry and all of those things. We can do it in a very healthy way. And then flight, the same thing. Like if I need to go walk around, or even just like run back and forth or whatever, just move my body in a way that allows that energy to move out. So I'm better at knowing that that's happening and going to those things and being like, okay, I'm listening to my body. And then the more, like, when I am absorbing information, I try not to absorb it to that place of PhD, because that's a huge coping mechanism for me. Like if I can have all the information and I can say it and be, the smartest person in the room or whatever it is that my mind is thinking, then I must know and it must be helping, right? But it's actually not. And so what I've started to do with information is just take what really resonates, like feel, like actually be with my body in those moments. And it's hard because, especially if you're like in a group situation, like we had a group workshop just recently, and sitting in those group situations, for me, I can feel everyone's energy in the room. And so it's like, is this mine? What's happening? And so it's like really being able to sit with myself in those moments is difficult. But if I can do it, all of a sudden these really small nuggets of information come in. Because in that particular situation, I knew a lot of that information already. I studied relationships in college. And so it all was like, all of this makes a lot of sense to me. And instead of shutting down, I was like, there's a nugget in here somewhere, or multiple ones. And, there were, and being able to feel that in my body was like, there were these little transformations happening in that moment that I've carried beyond that class. And that I'm now like, okay, these are things that I can work on, because it is a dysregulation, I feel like, to constantly be pulling exterior, or to be pointing a finger of, this is making me this way, or that person is making me do this. It's something that I have done and still tend to do less, but I still do it. And so that's those truths too. Like, it's like all these little things. For me, there was no one big thing. It's all these little like breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
That are leading to this like promised land, right? That isn't necessarily, I told you in my journal, I went back and read, like, when we first started this work together, my goal wasn't even to get rid of all my symptoms. My goal was to feel like I was the author of my story, that I was the leader of my life, not, all these programmings and all these other energies. And as I found out more about myself, it's like, to me, there isn't going to be one big event, because I'm having to deconstruct from so many different places. And so it's being okay with that, and also being okay with stepping away and being like, I need a break from all of this work. I'm just going to go, like, sit by a stream and not think about any of this work.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's so many pieces to it, but I think we do look for that one big event and don't collect the little ones and say, okay, look at how far I've come, even though, they've just been little tiny things. Like if you add them up and you write them down, or however you want to keep track of them, you're like, wow, look at me. Like, I'm doing a really great job.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that is what I was thinking as you were saying that, is like that idea of the silver bullet, right? Like, and I think that's so cultural, and I don't know. Yeah. I think there's a lot of places where that comes from, like this idea that there is an answer, like the thing, like this one, whatever that is. And part of me wonders if so many of us engage in intellectualizing and just this constant learning, because we're waiting for like something to click and just like that to be the answer. Like, okay, what's the accumulation of all this information? What's like the one nugget I need to just fix everything? So, and obviously that doesn't happen, because it's not a learning it's not a cognitive process. This work is all about subconscious work. It's about integration in the mind and body through that subconscious understanding, which then helps to regulate the nervous system. And that's all happening behind the scenes. And so intellectualizing is a very conscious process. And so you can learn all the things, you can even have an aha moment, but if there's not that crossing over, right, then it's not gonna get us there. And I think that that reliance on that external silver bullet, first of all, it's external, right? Like we're waiting for something outside of us to come in and just like make it happen, make it change. And again, that's cultural. That's our current medical paradigm. That's kind of how we've been taught to think about healthcare, is that the answer to my healing process lies outside of me. It's something that has to come from the outside in. So whether that's knowledge or a supplement or a medication or whatever, we're just expecting this thing to come in and like change things for us. So there's that. And then there's also that idea of it being one thing. And what you said is so perfect, is it's accumulation of things. It's accumulation of like steps and like practicing things and moving forward and going backwards and moving forward 3 steps and then going back 20. Like it's a back and forth constant like finding your footing. And I think really it's, that can be frustrating too, because we also like one size fits all, nice, tidy things. Like this is the therapy, this is how you do it, and this is what happens. And, we definitely have a framework in the work that we do together. Like we have this kind of like flow that we're working on, like nailing down and refining over time of what kind of the like general process can look like, just to help you get into a deeper place with yourself. But as you move through that, it's going to be very different for every single person, because everyone's conditioning, everyone's programming, everyone's subconscious stuff, everyone's traumas, stressors, like world, culture, whatever is different. Even 2 people growing up in the same house can have very different experiences based on so many factors. And so it's about learning how to apply like a general structure to your unique story. And really like this thing that comes up always, like I think the biggest pivotal thing in this work is we are like, our nervous system is programmed to move away from fear, to move away from pain, to move away from discomfort. It's biologically wired in us for that to be our response. And so it is very easy for that to just happen without us like noticing it or paying attention to it. It's just, again, it's like this thing that happens automatically. So it takes a concerted effort and awareness. I think awareness is really the key word here, to like switching into a place of embodiment. It's noticing like, how am I responding? Like, okay, I'm feeling like I'm noticing that I'm triggered, or I'm noticing that I'm scared. I'm noticing that I'm agitated. Like I'm learning all this stuff and nothing is happening. What is the problem here? What's going on? And if we start to maybe tune into like, I'm learning that I need to go into my body, but what is in my body that maybe is making me uncomfortable? Or, what is it about my past that makes me not want to look at it? Or what emotions do I not really express? There's lots of inroads that we teach in this work of how to start to bring the mind into the body and kind of start to bring that awareness to the body. But the gatekeeper is fear. The gatekeeper is discomfort. The gatekeeper is pain, symptoms, right? And if you're not able to see that as a gatekeeper, and you see it instead as a thing you need to get away from, then that crossing over into the body is going to be very challenging. And again, this is like, I want to normalize this, because without this understanding and without awareness, we don't know that. Like, it's not natural for us to be like, oh, pain, let's go see what that's about, right? Like, it's like, get away from it right now, right? Like that's our immediate response. And so we are really working against kind of this primitive, like these primitive structures in our brain that are wired for survival, wired to get us away from pain. But this quote that I love, and I say it a lot, is the Viktor Frankl quote, which is, and I'm not going to say it completely perfectly, but it's basically between stimulus and response, there's a choice, right? So if we can feel that kind of trigger, so maybe we're like reading about something and it's like, think about your childhood, and you're like, no, like something comes up about that. Like there's a choice in that moment where you have that response, where you can be like, okay, what am I feeling in my body right now? What's happening in my body? What's coming up for me, or whatever? Or like even a trigger like between you and your spouse or your friend or something, right? Like it doesn't have to be always about childhood trauma specifically. Any sort of trauma, any sort of pain, a symptom, anything like that comes up in your body and causes this response. If we can start to become mindful and aware, it's basically like slowing down enough to where you're not immediately acting, which is fight or flight. It's this very fast response that the nervous system wants us to move away from it right now. It's like, take your hand off the burner right now. And I'm not advocating for keeping your hand on a burner to learn a lesson. This is different. But like when you get triggered, right? If we can pause and like learn how to notice the response we want to have, and then start to understand there are other options, there are other ways to engage with that discomfort in our body, then that's where I think the quote is like, that's where all your freedom lies, right? And that's where healing exists, is in that choice point, in those like several paths that are opening up in front of you. And again, it's the hardest thing to do without awareness, without like kind of having a reframe, a paradigm shift around discomfort, and without having like, kind of knowing the steps to go down. So yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, again, why or how some of us just sort of naturally are like into like the darkness or the discomfort, or like, that's always been my personality, is just like, ooh, things that are challenging or tricky, like I want to go into it, right? Like that's just my personality. Whereas some of us are like, absolutely not, right? But regardless of our sort of like natural inclination or interest in discomfort, there is a need to move into that. And it sounds like for you, that was like a natural sort of like unfolding of like, I mean, I think I got to a place of like, well, this isn't working. So like, how, what am I missing? Like, what do I need to do differently here? And that's when I started to realize like, it's actually going into those hard places that starts to, allow me to transform them, versus staying up here and just intellectually understanding them. Is that kind of how you would think of your journey as well with that?
Yes. I also think that I was the same. I didn't really have a lot of issues with difficulty. I mean, I was the person that could keep calm in situations where everyone else was running around freaking out. I'm like, let's take a breath, everybody calm down. Like this isn't, and so I think when I found myself in that place of fear, so much fear because all of these symptoms were coming up, I was like, how can I reframe that for myself and be the person that I am in those situations, which is always so much more difficult, right? Like we can do it in situations for other people, but for whatever reason, when it comes back to doing it for us, we're like, yeah, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I need all of this help. I need all of these things, just tell me, what juice to drink and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, I know that seems like, I'm being facetious, but that is a real thing. Like was part of the very beginning of my journey, is there's got to be something, right, that I can take or ingest that will just make you feel better. And I think it's not about ingesting anything. It's about being able to digest your world, being able to digest what's happening inside, even those really, really dark places. And I think that's where this work gets hard.
Hi everyone, Dr. Erin here. So by now you're starting to get an idea of some of what the sacred illness paradigm is all about. The sacred illness paradigm is all about this question of what is your illness inviting you to become? What is it that lies within each of us that allows some of us to acquire so-called spontaneous healing or remissions? And what is the key to unlocking that innate self-healing capacity in each and every one of us? The Sacred Illness Blueprint is something that I developed as a guide to help you walk through this process step by step, to learn how to move deeper and deeper within yourself, to find these layers of dysregulation, of trauma, of limiting beliefs, of things that you're holding within your system that are keeping you small, stuck, and sick. Ultimately, if we ignore the mind-body connection and are not exploring the ways in which our nervous system continues to be dysregulated or in a chronic state of activation and stress, any healing modality that we put into our body from the outside in is going to be less effective, if not effective at all. So if you are currently feeling stuck, lost, confused, or disillusioned in your healing journey, feeling like you have tried so many things, you have tried so many modalities, you have worked with so many providers, and you're just not seeing the results you want, know that this is normal, and of course you're not, because this foundational mind-body connection is often, if not always, missed in all of these modalities. And just like we can't build a house on top of sand, our healing cannot grow and blossom and be strong and successful if the foundation is not laid first. So rather than doing something different but similar to everything you have tried before and expecting different results, I encourage you to consider doing something different altogether. This is where I invite you to explore the Sacred Illness Group Coaching Program. This is a low-cost monthly membership option that I have created. It's constantly open, constantly enrolling, where you can begin to explore this completely different way of engaging in your health, in your body, in your illness, and in your healing process. What is provided inside this group coaching program is the blueprint that lays the foundation and lays the path out for you to follow to begin to explore these deeper aspects of health, to truly get at the root of what is causing your illness, and from there allowing all other modalities to blossom so that you can actually start to see the changes and the healing take place in your body that you have been expecting and wanting all along. If you're ready and want to learn more, head on over to aurorasomatic.com, and at the top of the screen, click on Group Coaching, where you can read all about it and become a member today. I can't wait to see you on the inside, and for now, let's get back to the podcast.
This idea of how to move through these things and how to make those bridges between, fear, symptoms, and being regulated is so much awareness. Like, that's such a good way to put it, because we spend so much time aware of our outside world. If we are hypervigilant, which is a lot of us that have had trauma are hypervigilant, we can tell you what's going on outside of us, but when it comes to what's going on inside of us, we can't even sometimes verbalize it. And so I think that awareness is a big deal. And so for me, I think that it can start by even just being aware of the fact that you're being hypervigilant in a situation. So if I'm, let's say, being judging someone else outside of myself for something, like, if you can stop yourself in that moment and come back, that's you coming back into your body, even if it's just for half of a second, to say, okay, I'm not going to judge that person, and you don't go any further than that. That's okay, because you still did it. And so it's those little moments of awareness that are going to build. It's like a building block, and you'll eventually get to a stair where, you're not judging something outside of you or trying to pull something in from outside of you, because you're like, okay, I see what I'm doing. Let me come back into myself and decide why. And you're constantly asking yourself, why? What is it that's causing me to want this? What is it that's causing me to do this? I mean, I think we have to ask that question when we get into mind body work. If you're attracted to it, there's a part of you that pulls you to it, but then you have to ask yourself why. Because if you don't ask yourself why, and you don't get to those places of awareness on why I even chose this, then I genuinely think it's not going to work. Like, you're going to find some roadblock there that's going to throw you back into a similar pattern of, nothing works for me. I'm not enough for this work. I'm not enough to heal. I'm not worthy enough to heal, whatever. Like, so many things will come up in this work. So if you don't start off this work with, why am I drawn to this? What is it about me, my body, my mindset that draws me to this? And start from that place, then that awareness, I don't think, ever comes. I think you're always going to stay stuck in searching and pulling and, finding whatever the exterior things are, because there's so many of that. There's so much of that. I mean, there's so much information, and everybody's selling something, right? And so I think that's how you find your people. That's how you find your guides, is that awareness of yourself, though, not awareness of the fear. You have to have awareness of that too, but even beyond that, awareness of who I really am and why I'm really drawn to this.
100%. Yeah, I think that's such a really important and key piece to this, is that I don't even know what the word for that would be, not integrity necessarily, but just willingness to constantly come back to yourself, because our all of our stuff is about and I say this a lot, and I don't know if this is even a perfect way to describe it, but I think of it, all of life is like a Venn diagram, where there's you, there's the other thing, and where those two things cross over, there's going to be some sort of reaction. And in that reaction, again, it's kind of that quote where that's the space between those two things. you can take that reaction and throw it on that person and be like, well, it's because they're this person, or they're doing this, or it's because that wasn't right for me. And, this takes nuance, right? Because there are people who are bad for us, like point blank. There are situations that are bad for us. There are modalities that don't work. And so it's not about saying like you have to take everything on and own everything for yourself and everything is your fault. Because certainly that is something that a lot of us can believe too. Like, I'm not good enough. It's always me. I'm always the problem, right? So it's not about taking everything on and like blaming yourself, but it's a different, more empowered ownership of saying every moment of discomfort, this is a point of growth that I have a choice over. I get to have a say in the direction of my life. This trigger is not like I'm not powerless. It's not their fault. It's not my fault, but there's something here to be learned. Like, it's medicine, right? There's this quote that I posted on social media the other day that was like, no one's your friend, no one's your enemy, everyone is your teacher. And I think that can be extrapolated to life in general. Like, nothing is like inherently like, against us or for us. It's all just like, what is your reaction to it, and how can you own that and work with that? And so that is, I think, the key piece to how you take this and actually move into deep layers of healing, like you said, is like this ownership. I guess that's the word, is like taking ownership of it and knowing like it's okay if your history or your, historically, it has been easier to put it on someone else. I know we've all done that. Like, I will be the first to admit that I'm like really good at blaming my husband for a lot of stuff, or like blaming other people, or I don't know, whatever, right? Like pushing things off. Because I think, again, too, it's like it's easier to not take accountability for things that really hurt and really suck. And it can be a coping mechanism to move away from pain, right? Like, we're constantly kind of moving away from pain and staying, quote unquote, safe by staying with what's familiar and not having to go into these darker, harder places. So, I think there's a definite like need to validate like everyone is doing their best. I truly believe that. Even the people who are doing like terrible things in the world are doing their best, like with what they have, with the programming they have, with the limiting beliefs they have, right? With whatever they came into the world kind of being surrounded by and like brought up in. Like, we all have, again, we're all unique little like architectural structures of like our environments and how we kind of manifest that in the world. So we are all doing our best. And in order for us, like for those of us who are really seeking like a different way, like when we're sick of the status quo, when we're sick of things like having this algorithmic, like, well, you have this, so it means this, and this is the outcome. Like, when we're sick of kind of abiding by this black and white binary world that we live in, this is where we have to take ownership of like, okay, so what's mine? Like, how do I start to alchemize my own internal world and change it in this way that is going to take it's going to be uncomfortable, because I'm going to have to take on a lot of stuff that I have historically put over here. But therein lies the magic of this work. And so I think it is about, ownership, taking it in. And the biggest thing is this idea of fear and safety, right? Like, our nervous system is always wanting to feel safe. And so it's always going to move us toward what is familiar, which is old patterns of coping with the world. So in order to really establish like what I think of as true safety, true embodiment, true regulation of the nervous system, we have to be able to decipher between like what is a fear-based safety versus what is a safe-based safety, if that makes sense. And I was reading the other day too, and this comes back to like, we have to be aware and we have to take ownership of ourselves in order to be able to find that distinction. Fear is always like, if it's a fear-based like motivation, it's always going to be focused on the past or the future. It's going to be like, well, this is what happened before, so that's going to happen again, so I can't do that. Or like, this is, like, everyone has failed me before, nothing has worked before, so this is no different, get away from it, right? For an example. Or it's future based, which is like, I don't know, you're not worth it, or this is never going to work for you, or what you want is silly, or, like these are all the bad things that could happen if you move down this path. So fear is always taking you out of the present moment. So if you are finding yourself at a threshold where you're running through your mind like all the things that happened before, why it won't work, or all the things that could happen in the future, why it's bad, that's fear. That's not truly like you in your integrity and in your like authentic aligned self. Intuition is different because it's very much in the present moment. It's very much in like, you're seeing it for what it is. You're like, okay, I know that if I engage with this thing by avoiding it, or by blaming it on my spouse, or by just quitting it or whatever it is, or by reading another book before applying what I'm learning. I know in this present moment that like what I'm really feeling is I need to go deeper into this. Like there's no future thinking, there's no past thinking. It's like right now I feel very strongly that this is where I need to go. And so it's kind of a different, I mean, I think we've all had intuitions or like gut feelings about things, right? So it's very much tuning into that feeling and recognizing like there will not be any future or past like tripping, so to speak. Like you won't be moving into one or the other if it's intuition guiding you. And we can connect really strongly with our intuition when we take ownership for things. Because naturally, if we are intellectualizing or moving into this place of like kind of not taking action, it's like, well, I need to read one more thing before I can do anything about this because I don't quite know this yet. Like it's this like future kind of like in the future, I will take action. But right now I don't know enough. So I'm going to keep moving forward. So I think that's maybe a helpful filter for starting to understand like, what is like truly bad for me. Like in this moment, this person feels really, really toxic for my system. I feel really overwhelmed in their presence, not based on like, ideas of the past or the future. Like, how does your body feel when you're really embodied, when you're like connected to yourself? Or this modality just doesn't feel quite right. It's not really resonating with me, right? There's a different feeling when we are like in the moment embodied in relationship with the thing. So again, that takes ownership and kind of tuning in and awareness. So yeah, and the thing you said about community too, I think is really important because there is also that feeling of being alone, being isolated, being the only one. And when you start to, like, I know for my own self, as I've been moving through this challenging time I'm in my own life, having people like kind of keep me on track and be like, no, you're right there. Like, you're right there. This is all supposed to be happening. This is just a lot of fear coming up. Like, it's really helpful to have people have that outside perspective too, because in reality, like we're not supposed to be isolated. Our nervous systems regulate best in community. Like I think you and I have talked about this, like we'd be great if we lived on a mountain all by ourselves, like we'd be healthy and perfect and no problem, which is like, I think most of us would probably be that way. But the reality is that our nervous systems need other nervous systems. Like we need to connect to other human beings. And also that's where we learn stuff, like, because that's where challenges come up and that's where triggers come up. So those interactions are both healing in a sense of support and healing in a sense of like triggers and challenges. So that's all to say that like having people around you who are on that path and in that same mindset can be really crucial too. So I think to kind of maybe start to wrap this up, I just want to mention again, like intellectualizing is this idea of never quite feeling enough, right? Like you don't quite have enough information, or you feel like you're kind of constantly consuming like external products, so to speak, whether it is supplements or like you're constantly learning about something new you can do. What else can I add to this regimen? And it's kind of like a fine line between like, are you taking it in? Are you absorbing it? Are you actually letting it like come into your body and like accepting it as healing and feeling worthy of it, loving yourself, being in your body? Like, and it's like this kind of like both and of like, are you taking in information from the outside, but also working with what's on the inside at the same time? Because if it's all external, then you're missing still the like roots of like what's actually deep in your system. These things are not going to eradicate the roots if you're not willing to look at them. You can't just blindly pull a weed out. You have to you have to get in there with your shovel and make sure you get all the little pieces and all the tendrils. So, again, it's very normal to intellectualize things, to like move away from what is uncomfortable, to move away from what is triggering. And for those who are feeling frustrated or feeling like they're spinning their wheels or they're doing so much, if you feel like you're doing so much to get better and nothing is working, this might be something to just reflect on in a completely non-judgmental way. Like, am I someone who is kind of constantly avoiding like actually doing the work that I'm learning? Like, am I not embodying it? Am I not actually getting into those layers and finding what's there? And if so, great. You just opened up the next layer of your journey, right? Like now you have the next step, the next way to work with this. Any thoughts for you just as like a final, no pressure, 5 minutes summary?
I think just like to touch on the blame thing, because I think that can play a big role in these like looking and searching for information and being in that space, is we start to blame ourselves of not doing enough or not knowing enough or any of those things. And so I think that is a space where we can ask ourselves, is it possible for me to move from blaming myself for all of this? Because that's not really the work. We have to take responsibility, and we have to understand how we have lived our lives in order for us to be going through the things that we're going through and experiencing the symptoms. But how can we now change that from blame to having a deep sacred belief in ourselves? And that mindset reframe, I think, will take you deeper into that space of, I don't need any more information. And I was led to this space that's telling me that I can heal myself through what I already have inside of me, because now you have this, now you're creating this deep belief system that isn't from fear. It's from true safety. It's from that intuitive place, because this is a belief in myself, not a belief that someone outside of me has an answer, because we're all unique in everything that we express. Even these healing expressions that show up as symptoms, we're unique in that. You and I could have gone through the exact same things and had two different expressions of that and be having to heal different. And so no one outside of you is going to be able to tell you exactly how to fix that, exactly how to heal that, because they're not you and they didn't go through those things. So in order for you to truly be able to move on in this work is to find that deep belief in yourself that you are guiding yourself to the right places and the right thing.
Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Sacred Illness Podcast. If you find this information shared here inspirational and educational, please share it with those you think would benefit from this work. To take this work deeper yourself, check out our website, www.aurorasomatic.com, where you can explore our coaching, community, and course options. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, where new content is coming out all the time, intended to inspire, awaken, and help you deepen your relationship with yourself, your life, and your world. We'll see you next time.